Okay, JT, so why mental performance?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, MJ. And it goes back to this simple idea that you can never outperform your self-image. And what I mean by that is I think of my own experience as a little boy and what sport was for me. Sport was something that allowed me to feel seen. It allowed me to feel heard and appreciated. And to be truthful, I know that this is something everyone probably experiences at some point in their life is I didn't always feel that way. So it was really a vehicle that allowed me to use my, natural gifts, talents, and abilities, which again is, we love that, right? It feels good when we're doing things that we're great at. But with the other side of that coin is it also, a part of the driver was to seek out that external validation, right? Those praise, right? Whatever that is, the championships, the recognition, the all-stars, whatever that is. And fast forward, again, it's not good or bad. But what I've come to learn in my own transition over the last 2 years, leaving my career in education and coaching in a traditional sense, is that we are so programmed and conditioned to live from the outside in, right? To seek out things outside of us. So in my own growth journey over the last couple of years, I've really learned how to be more driven from the inside out. And from that process, it's made me realize that my performance in the game of life, whether it's, as a husband, as a dad, even as a coach now working with my clients, or my ability to serve others, the people I'm working with, is so much greater. So it really comes back to that idea of you can never outperform your self-image, and we really start to need to understand how to actually live from the inside out.
And you're right? Society's often, trained us to work from the outside, and whether it's advertisement for products or like there's this whole idea that it's favorable to work from a deficit, right? Like to want something that you can't have, right? Whereas it's, like you said, so enlightening to realize that you can provide a lot of what you need for yourself if you can get into the right headspace, right? And I love what you touch on too about the idea of, when you were younger, getting into sport, becoming, I don't know if it was like for you, but kind of addicted to sport, or just really enjoying your experience, and how that, maybe filled some voids that existed prior to that involvement in sport. And that's a really interesting point to me, because I wonder how common that is. That maybe there are kids that struggle in certain areas, or they come along sport and all of a sudden all of this external validation and reward and acknowledgement and recognition is there. And all of that stuff is amazing about sports. But there are some negatives that come along with that, right? And I think sometimes the athletes, the parents, the coaches, everyone involved will make exceptions for that because the good outweighs the bad, right? Whereas in my mind, I'd like to believe that there's a world where we can provide these kids with the external validation, the rewards and acknowledgement, but also motivate and empower them to be able to acknowledge and reward themselves internally, right? To empower them. Because I think in my mind, it would be great to have a scenario where they're getting the best of both worlds, so that beyond their playing days, right? Beyond their time as in sport, it's not they graduate from sport and then they hit this wall where they don't know who they are outside of their sport, right? Their identity is so tied to that, but it's not just their identity that's tied to it, it's their reward system. It's their value of who they are is tied to their sport. So to create a situation where, yes, sports are an important part of your life, but they don't make or break you, and identify who those athletes are outside of their sport, so that transition can be a little bit smoother.
Mm-hmm. And, you bring up a great point that, it's not good or bad. It's just I think one thing I've come to realize is that it's just having that understanding, right? Like having greater awareness. And what I've come to learn in this transition is, how does that programming, how do we become programmed to live from the outside in? And I think of my own time in simple education. Our worth is determined by an arbitrary mark out of 0 to 100 on a test. Right?
Yeah.
It's the number on a scoreboard. And then as we get older, it's the number of zeros on our paycheck. It's a job title, a job promotion. And again, it's not good or bad. Like I'm a firm believer that high performers have this delicate harmony between being intrinsically driven, but also, we do have this need to achieve externally, but understand that the power is learning how to be driven most of the time intrinsically. Mm-hmm. So I find that as I've learned that and learning to harness that ambition, that drive, that coachability, which all high-level athletes have. It's what we've learned to do. That's why we were able to excel on the field, on the ice, on the court. Mm-hmm. But it's just learning to harness that and learning how to apply that to other areas of your life.
Yeah. And as a leader, how do you think we can facilitate that transition in value, right? Because like you said, it's deeply ingrained, it's long-standing, you score, you're doing great, or you win, you're a better team than the team across from you. Like, what are things that we can do as leaders to try to help balance that out?
I'm a firm believer, and I'll premise this. I had a client once who was a former teaching colleague, and he asked me once this question, like, what's your truth? And I was like, I love asking questions, like thoughtful questions. And I was like, that is one of the best questions. And I shared with him that everyone has greatness inside of them, right? Like, that's my fundamental truth. I have greatness inside of me. You have greatness inside of you. Everyone listening, all your audience has that. And I think once we start to help people start to understand that truth, that greatness is inside of them, that the power to create change is always within them, mm-hmm. that the more we share those simple ideas, the more we give people opportunities to hear them and then even apply them, that their awareness is just going to grow. And once they take those simple ideas like greatness inside of me, and they start to think and act from that place and take action, I feel like naturally they're going to feel empowered. So it's simple ideas like that, and having platforms like this amazing platform, this Coach Life community that you're helping to create, that the more we share them, the more opportunities we have, the more servant-based leaders like yourself that are sharing these ideas, the better the world will be.
Yeah. It's that fundamental shift, right? Because like you said, I think often we accomplish things outside of ourselves. And as a result of that, we feel confident, we feel empowered, we feel like we can do things. Whereas the shift is, okay, how do we find an intrinsic source of that confidence and empowerment? And then the byproduct becomes those external accomplishments, right? Yep. Versus I have to accomplish something to feel great. It's I feel great and therefore I'm able to accomplish, right? And it's a major shift.
Yeah. Would it be okay if I shared just a story from?
Of course.
So I was speaking with a youth sport football team a couple of weeks ago, and I was sharing the first step into being great at the game of life is you have to get clear on what you want. Right? Again, get clarity on what you want, what you really want. And that question can apply to anything: health, school, your career, your relationships. How it happens is none of your concern. And you can see kind of the wheels turning, right? Especially with a lot of these young men. Mm-hmm. And I said, as soon as you ask how, and we've been conditioned to ask how in that way, all that happens is your mind starts to get filled, your conscious mind gets filled with doubt and worry. It starts to go, oh my gosh, how am I going to find the time to do this? What are people going to, right? what are people going to think of me? Da, da, da. And we start literally creating this chaos in our mind, which again isn't good or bad. It just is. And we start, our old conditioning talks us out of doing the thing that we really want to do.
Yeah.
So I think it's really taking responsibility, that your first responsibility in the game of life is to get clear on what you want, right? And getting some clarity on that question, even just starting to, is such a freeing and empowering question.
Yeah. And I would even take it a step further and add the why, right? So understanding why that matters to you. I don't know if you're familiar with the Simon Sinek book, The Power of Why, right? And that circle diagram where it's like the why is in the middle. And the concept is that if you can connect with why something really matters to you, like we talked about, right? Like your purpose. If you can get clear on what your purpose is, which will shine light on what it is matters most to you, then that is kind of what will impact your behaviors, right? Because it speaks to a certain part of the brain that actually drives your behavior. Whereas, like you said, if you start with the how, right, and you worry about that first and foremost, that's talking to the limbic part of your brain, which, organizes and processes, but it doesn't drive your behavior. And that's how we can really get lost. And we can think that we want certain things, but if we're not clear on the importance of that or the value of that to us intrinsically, then it just doesn't carry the same kind of weight in terms of actually being able to behave in a way that aligns with that goal, right? And in sport, that ties a lot to the concept of having a mission statement at the beginning of the year, right? Getting together as a team, collectively deciding, why are we here? What is it that we want to accomplish? And being able to go back to that. So it's interesting for sure.
And I love that you talk about, getting clear on why you're doing it. And really what came up for me, I thought about, is that idea of when your why. It's that place where you get emotionally involved with an idea, right? It's just, you become energized, enthused, you're passionate, fire in your belly, which again, anyone that's played at a high level knows that, like that enthusiasm on game day, right? Before the puck drops, before the ball's kicked off, for tip off. And that's where that beauty of life is, in that moment, right? Where it's just that anticipation. And like you said, so I love that you're talking about, like, get clear on why, your purpose.
Yeah, because exactly like you said, there's like a physiological, biological reaction when you were in that space, right? And that's kind of a sign. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking, like, even if you're an athlete, it's like, what do I want to do? Well, I want to do this. But if you don't feel, like that physiological response when you're talking about it, maybe that's not it, right? Or maybe you need to dig deeper to find out what's the what behind that that's driving it, right? And I think that's where a lot of athletes fall short, and maybe even some coaches fall short, or maybe they're just not equipped to help the athletes figure that out. And that ties into the mental performance piece. This is the fundamental start of all of it. Why are you there? Right? Yeah. Why does this matter to you? Why should this matter to you? And I think there's a difference too, because sometimes as coaches, we're really good at telling athletes why this should matter to you.
Yep.
But unless you know why it does matter to them, then there's just a little bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point, right? Like helping, that's one thing, MJ, I think you do a great job of, is prompting questions. Like you're one of the favorite people that I follow on social, just because I always like you always prompt with a powerful question that always prompts me to stop and think. And it's interesting that, the best coaches, the best leaders in any area of your life, and this is something I learned from one of my great coaches and mentors, is they find out what people want, right? Like they are want creators, right? They really get at the core of what's that driver for that person, like intrinsically. And then what they do is they show them the most efficient and effective way to get there. And what I prompt people is, think of your favorite coaches, your favorite teachers, your favorite bosses that you've had. They did those two things. So that idea that was shared to me has been a game changer for me in my leadership journey.
Who was your favorite coach and why?
I would say I would be hard pressed to pinpoint one coach. I will say that because one of my superpowers is my curiosity, that willingness to always ask questions, to reflect, I have sort of taken pieces from every coach, because I've just learned that when you're open to learning from anyone, you start to realize that life is filled with inherent lessons. Mm-hmm. One of the unique parts about my journey is during my high school coaching career and community coaching career, I was always one of the youngest coaches. So the amazing part was I was grateful and blessed to be able to follow in some coaches that coached me in university. So it was this interesting dynamic. So, I think back to one of my mentors, maybe I'll highlight a couple. I think of one of my good friends, Todd McKay. One thing that I learned from him was we were not the most talented football program, like in terms of we didn't always get the biggest, the strongest, the fastest athletes. But he was so good at preaching this consistent message about our ABCs, our core pillars, that our players embodied them on the football field, off the football field, in all areas of life. They were great young men. Mm-hmm. And the interesting part was that we always played to the best of our ability. Now, we may not have won as many, championships as other teams, but very often we could look back and reflect back on the season and go, you know what? We maximized our potential. Most of our players had a great experience. Mm-hmm. And they're such great young people, and we see them thriving in the next phase of their life. So that would probably be, as I'm sharing here, that would probably be Coach McKay would probably be one of the greatest mentors I've had, just for that simple idea of like consistency, consistent messaging.
Yeah. It sounds so simple, right? The idea of just being consistent with your messaging, but it's difficult. I think it's something that a lot of coaches can struggle with, because even the idea of putting together a mission statement, sometimes people will do that at the beginning of the year. But once the season gets going, there's so many distractions that can come from different directions, or we become very reactive, right? So based on the performance on the weekend, we might be like, okay, we have to do this, or you're kind of stuck putting out fires over the course of the season. It's really easy to get caught up in that rather than stay the course with what you're preaching at the beginning. And like you said, I love that idea, but it ties into the idea of values-based coaching, right? So being clear on what your values are. When you coach to that, you do create an environment where the athletes, it's more the athletes' performance versus themselves yesterday, right? Like you are looking inward. When we talk about values have nothing to do with what the other team is doing across the field or court or ice from you. Values really draws the attention onto yourselves. And am I living true to what I say matters? So it's a great strategy as long as you can hold yourself and your team accountable to it, which takes a special coach to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I love that you talked about this idea of values, right? Because, hey, we understand that in the game of life, that challenges, obstacles, setbacks are going to pop up. Mm-hmm. But you always have a choice in those moments. Are you going to react, which is easy, or are you going to intentionally respond? Mm-hmm. And what I learned from that, and just piggybacking off what I was sharing with Coach McKay, is the lesson I taught when I had the opportunity to become a head coach at my last school I taught at. I took that same idea of consistency, but I created it in what I thought, the verbiage that I thought worked well, right? And what resonated with our players. And I realized I was still taking the same principle of being consistent, but it was that preaching that, and not just preaching it, but embodying it, right? Because I'm a firm believer that the best leaders, the most effective leaders, are the ones that only preach what they are willing to consistently practice themselves.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it was a great lesson that just learning those ideas and then making it my own. And yeah, so it's been I just love the growth process.
Yeah. Well, and that's the cool thing about values too, is that, so they're not only intrinsic, but they can be enacted or acted upon regardless of the situation. So like you said, when things are going well, we can live to our values. When struggles arise, we can still live to our values. So they can be that constant source in the world of sport, which can be very much like a roller coaster, right? It kind of keeps you on the tracks rather than flying off the handle. Yeah.